When I decided to leave Baltimore and move to Greenville, it wasn't because I had some grand plan or an escape route mapped out. It was more of a leap of faith, a hope that a smaller city might give me the chance to build the kind of life I always wanted. Baltimore had become suffocating in its way. Too much noise, too many bad memories. When I was offered a job in fuel delivery, it felt like the perfect excuse to pack up and start over. Greenville wasn't what I expected. I'd imagined it would be quieter, calmer, with people who waved at strangers on the sidewalk and neighbors who borrowed sugar from each other. Instead, it was a strange mix of small-town charm and big-city hustle. I liked the pace after I adjusted to it, and the job wasn't bad. It was hard work, long hours driving trucks and delivering fuel to businesses, but it was honest. The money wasn't great, but it was enough to keep me afloat and let me save for the dream I'd held on to since my teenage years, owning my own business. It was in Greenville that I met Hannah. She worked at a cafe near the depot where I picked up my truck each morning. I was immediately drawn to her. She had this quiet confidence, a way of carrying herself that made her stand out. She wasn't flashy or loud, but there was something about her that demanded attention. It took me a few weeks of awkward small talk over coffee orders before I finally worked up the courage to ask her out. Our first date was a little Italian restaurant downtown. I remember being nervous, worried that I'd say something stupid or spill marinara sauce on my shirt. But Hannah put me at ease. She laughed easily and asked questions about my life, seeming genuinely interested in my plans and dreams. By the end of the night, I knew she was someone special. We got married 2 years later, in a small ceremony at a park by the river. It wasn't extravagant, we couldn't afford anything too fancy, but it was perfect. Hannah looked beautiful in her simple white dress, and I couldn't believe how lucky I was to have found her. A few months later, we found out she was pregnant with our first child. When our son, Noah, was born, I felt like my life was finally coming together. A year and a half later, we welcomed another boy, Owen. Our family felt complete. For a while, everything was good. Better than good, really. I loved coming home after a long day on the road to the sound of Noah and Owen's laughter and the smell of whatever Hannah was cooking for dinner. On weekends, we'd take the boys to the park or have picnics in the backyard. Life was simple, but it was ours. But as the years went on, things began to shift. Hannah decided to go back to work, which I supported. She'd always talked about wanting to do more, and I knew she missed having something of her own outside of being a mom. She got a job as a marketing coordinator for a local company, and at first, everything seemed fine. She was excited about the work, and I was proud of her. Then the late night started. At first, it was just the occasional meeting that ran over or a deadline that kept her in the office after hours. But soon, it became more frequent. She started going out for drinks with coworkers after work or attending networking events that seemed to happen every week. She assured me it was all part of the job, and I tried to believe her. It wasn't just work, though. Hannah started reconnecting with old friends, people she hadn't seen in years. She'd go out for lunch or coffee with them on weekends, leaving me at home with the boys. I didn't mind taking care of the kids. I loved spending time with them, but I couldn't help feeling like I was being sidelined. One night, I decided to bring it up. It was late, and we were sitting in the living room after putting the boys to bed. Hannah was scrolling through her phone, barely looking at me as I spoke. "Do you think you've been spending a lot of time away from home lately?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She glanced up, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "You've been working late almost every night," I said. "And when you're not working, you're out with friends. It just feels like you're not around as much anymore." She sighed, setting her phone down. "Tony, I'm trying to balance everything. Work is demanding, and I need to maintain those relationships if I want to grow in my career. And as for my friends, is it so bad that I want to catch up with people I haven't seen in years?" "No, it's not bad," I said. "But it feels like you're pulling away from us." "That's not fair," she said, her voice rising. "I'm doing this for us, for our family. If I'm successful at work, it benefits all of us." I wanted to believe her, but something about the way she said it didn't sit right with me. It felt like an excuse, a way to deflect instead of addressing the real issue. As the months went on, the distance between us grew. We stopped talking about our dreams and started bickering over little things. Whose turn it was to do the dishes, who forgot to pay a bill. The boys noticed the tension, asking why Mommy and Daddy didn't sit together at dinner anymore. I didn't have an answer for them. Hannah's social life became a sore spot. She started attending more events, staying out later, and coming home with stories about how much fun she'd had. I tried to be understanding, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her. The breaking point came one Saturday evening. Hannah was supposed to be home for dinner, but she called to say she'd be late. "I'm meeting up with some friends from work," she said. "Don't wait up." I hung up without responding. That night, as I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me, I realized that the life we'd built was slipping through my fingers, and I didn't know how to stop it. I loved Hannah, but I couldn't ignore the growing chasm between us. Something had to change, but I didn't know where to start. All I knew was that the life I'd dreamed of, the family I'd worked so hard to build, was unraveling before my eyes, and I was powerless to stop it. It started as a gut feeling, one I couldn't quite put into words. Something about Hannah had changed, not just her late nights or sudden need for space, but the way she looked at me, or rather didn't. Her gaze would skim over me, as though I were part of the furniture. She smiled less, laughed even less, and when I reached out to her, emotionally or physically, she pulled away. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was stress. Her job was demanding, and she was trying to balance that with raising 2 kids. But as the weeks dragged on, it became harder to ignore the signs. The phone calls she took in hushed tones, the texts she quickly swiped away when I walked into the room, the sudden care she put into her appearance before heading to work. All of it painted a picture I wasn't ready to see. The tipping point came one evening when I ran into an old friend, Dave, at the hardware store. Dave had always been the kind of guy who knew everyone and everything going on in town, a walking gossip column. "Hey, Tony," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "How's it going?" "Not bad," I lied. "How about you?" We exchanged small talk for a few minutes before he leaned in, lowering his voice. "Listen, man, I wasn't sure if I should bring this up, but I've seen Hannah around a couple of times. She's been out with her boss, right?" I froze. "What do you mean?" "I mean, they've been having lunch at that bistro downtown," he said, scratching his head. "I saw them last week, and they look close." My stomach churned. "Close how?" Dave hesitated. "Look, I don't want to cause trouble, but it didn't seem like a normal work lunch, if you know what I mean." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Dave's words in my head, and the more I thought about it, the more it all made sense. Rodney, her boss, the man she'd mentioned casually 100 times, always with a little too much enthusiasm. The man she'd gone to high school with, someone she already knew and trusted. It felt like a betrayal hiding in plain sight. The next day, I decided to pay a visit to her office. I told myself it was innocent, that I just wanted to surprise her and maybe take her out to lunch. But deep down, I knew I was looking for something, confirmation, closure, anything. When I arrived, the receptionist looked surprised to see me. "Hi, can I help you?" "I'm here to see Hannah," I said, forcing a smile. "She's out at lunch," the receptionist said, glancing at the clock. "She left about 15 minutes ago." "With Rodney?" I asked before I could stop myself. Her eyes widened slightly, and she quickly recovered. "I'm not sure." I didn't wait to hear more. I left the office and drove to the bistro Dave had mentioned. Sure enough, there they were, sitting at a corner table by the window. Rodney was leaning in close, saying something that made Hannah laugh in a way I hadn't seen her laugh in months. Her hand rested lightly on his arm, and the sight of it made my chest tighten. That evening, after the boys were in bed, I confronted her. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, when I sat down across from her. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but firm. She looked up, startled. "What's wrong?" "I know about you and Rodney." Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she masked it with a frown. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Hannah," I said. "I saw you today. At lunch. With him." She sighed, setting her phone down. "Tony, it was just a work lunch. There's nothing going on." "Cut the crap," I snapped. "I've heard the stories. I've seen the way you act around him. I'm not an idiot." Her face flushed, but she didn't back down. "You're being paranoid," she said. "Rodney's my boss. Of course we spend time together. That doesn't mean I'm having an affair." "Then explain the texts," I said, pulling out my phone and opening a screenshot I'd taken when she wasn't looking. It was a message from Rodney that read, "Can't stop thinking about last night. Let's make it happen again soon." Her face paled. You went through my phone? Don't turn this around on me, I said. I'm not the one sneaking around and lying to my family. For a moment, I thought she might confess, but instead, she stood up and crossed her arms. I can't believe you don't trust me, she said, her voice shaking with anger. After everything we've been through, you're really going to throw it all away over some stupid text? I stood up, too, my hands clenched in a fist at my sides. You already threw it away, Hannah, I said. Don't blame me for picking up the pieces. After that night, everything changed. We stopped pretending. Hannah moved into the guest room, and we avoided each other as much as possible. For the sake of the boys, we agreed to keep living under the same roof, but it was clear to both of us that our marriage was over. The boys noticed the shift, of course. Noah, who was older and more perceptive, asked me one night why Mommy and Daddy didn't hug anymore. I didn't know what to say, so I told him the same lie I'd been telling myself. We're just going through a tough time, buddy. But we both love you very much. Hannah and I communicated only when necessary, mostly about the boys' schedules or household logistics. She stopped going out as much, but the damage was already done. Every time I saw her, I was reminded of what she'd done, of what she'd taken from me. The hardest part was the silence, the absence of laughter, of shared dreams and quiet moments. The house felt like a prison, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was serving a sentence for a crime I didn't commit. I thought about leaving, about packing up and starting over somewhere else. But every time I looked at Noah and Owen, I knew I couldn't. They needed me, and I wasn't about to let Hannah's betrayal take that away from them. So I stayed. For them. But deep down, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Hannah had always looked forward to her company's Christmas parties. Every December, she'd spend days planning her outfit, obsessing over which dress would strike the perfect balance between elegant and festive. This year was no different, except for the dark cloud of tension hanging over our marriage. When she casually mentioned that Rodney would be hosting the event at his country club, I felt a surge of anger, but forced myself to stay calm. You should come, she said, her voice nonchalant, as if daring me to decline. People are starting to talk about why you never show up. It wasn't the first time she'd mentioned it, and part of me suspected she wanted me there for appearances more than anything else. Still, I agreed. If nothing else, it would give me the chance to see Rodney up close again, to watch him squirm under my gaze. The party was everything I expected. Opulent, shallow, and drowning in fake laughter. The ballroom was decked out in twinkling lights, oversized ornaments, and a towering Christmas tree that screamed money. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, while a jazz band played holiday classics in the corner. Hannah looked stunning in her emerald green dress, her hair swept up into an elegant bun. For a moment, I almost forgot about everything. Her betrayal, the lies, the distance between us. Almost. Rodney greeted us near the bar, his grin as smarmy as ever. Tony, glad you could make it, he said, extending a hand. I shook it reluctantly, squeezing harder than necessary. Wouldn't miss it. He turned to Hannah, his grin widening. And you look absolutely radiant tonight. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to wipe that smile off his face. Hannah thanked him, her tone polite but reserved. I wondered if she was playing it safe, knowing I was watching her every move. The evening dragged on, filled with forced conversations and awkward small talk. I stayed close to Hannah, keeping an eye on her interactions with Rodney. At one point, I caught them exchanging a glance across the room, a fleeting, knowing look that sent a wave of nausea through me. I excused myself and headed to the bar, needing a moment to collect my thoughts. That's when I noticed they were both gone. My heart pounded as I scanned the room, looking for any sign of them. They weren't on the dance floor, and they weren't near the bar. A waiter walked by, and I grabbed his arm. Have you seen my wife? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She's wearing a green dress. He hesitated, then nodded toward the hallway. I think she went that way, sir. I followed his direction, my steps quick and purposeful. The hallway was dimly lit, lined with doors leading to various private rooms. I paused, listening for any sound, and that's when I heard it, a muffled giggle, followed by a low murmur. The sound was coming from the men's room. My hands trembled as I pushed the door open, and what I saw confirmed every fear, every suspicion I'd tried to push aside. Hannah was backed against the sink, her hands gripping Rodney's shoulders as he leaned into her. They both froze when they saw me, their expressions shifting from shock to panic. For a moment, no one moved, the air thick with tension. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice echoing off the tiled walls. "Tony, it's not what it looks like," Hannah stammered, her face pale. "Oh, it's exactly what it looks like," I snarled, stepping toward Rodney. "Get your hands off my wife." Rodney raised his hands in a mock surrender, his smug grin still plastered on his face. "Tony, let's not make a scene." That was the wrong thing to say. Before I knew it, my fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling to the floor. He scrambled to his feet, blood dripping from his nose, but I wasn't done. I grabbed him by the collar and dragged him out of the bathroom, ignoring Hannah's frantic protests. "What are you doing?" she cried, following us into the ballroom. I didn't answer. The music faltered as I shoved Rodney onto the dance floor, his disheveled appearance drawing gasps and whispers from the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice loud and steady, "allow me to introduce your host, Rodney the homewrecker." Rodney tried to stand, but I pushed him back down, my rage boiling over. "This man has been sleeping with my wife," I continued, my words cutting through the stunned silence. "So let's all raise a glass to the boss of the year." Hannah was sobbing now, begging me to stop, but I ignored her. I wanted everyone to see them for what they were: liars, cheaters, cowards. I left the party without looking back, my chest heaving with adrenaline. When I got home, I packed a bag for myself and the boys. They were asleep, blissfully unaware of the chaos unfolding around them. I carried them to the car, one by one, and drove to my sister Rachel's house on the other side of town. Rachel opened the door, her eyes widening in surprise. "Tony, what's going on?" "I can't explain right now," I said, carrying the boys inside. "I just need a place to stay for a while." She didn't press me for details, just nodded and helped me settle the boys into her guest room. Once they were asleep, I told her everything about Hannah, Rodney, the party, the bathroom. By the time I finished, her face was a mix of anger and pity. "Tony," she said gently, "you need to figure out what you want to do next. For yourself. And for the boys." I spent the next few days in a fog, trying to process everything. I avoided Hannah's calls and texts, not ready to face her or the mess we'd created. Part of me wanted to fight for our marriage, for the life we'd built together. But another part of me knew that some things couldn't be fixed. For now, I needed space. Time to think. Time to decide whether there was anything left worth saving. When I left the party with the boys that night, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let Rodney walk away unscathed. The man had destroyed my marriage, humiliated me in front of my family, and trampled over every boundary of decency. Hannah's betrayal stung like hell, but Rodney was the architect of my misery, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. The idea of revenge took root in my mind like a stubborn weed. At first, it was just an outlet for my anger, something to distract me from the pain. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Rodney deserved consequences, and if no one else was going to deliver them, I would. I called an old friend from Baltimore, Nate. We'd grown up together, gotten into more trouble than I could count as teenagers, and stayed in touch over the years despite going our separate ways. Nate had a knack for fixing problems, legal and otherwise, and I knew he'd have some ideas. "Tony," he said when I called him, his voice warm and familiar. "It's been a while. What's going on?" "I need a favor," I said, cutting straight to the point. "A big one." Nate chuckled. "I'm listening." I told him everything about Hannah, the affair, the humiliation at the party. By the time I finished, his tone had shifted from amusement to seriousness. "Damn," he said. "That's rough. You sure you want to go down this road?" "I'm sure," I said. "I don't want anything crazy, just enough to knock him off his pedestal." Nate was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think I have an idea, but it's going to take some planning." Over the next week, Nate and I worked out the details. The first step was creating an airtight alibi. Nate arranged for me to visit his family in Boston, where his niece, Sarah, was living. She was a sweet, sharp college student who'd grown up hearing stories about Uncle Tony and was more than willing to help. "You'll stay with Sarah for the weekend," Nate explained. "We'll make sure there are plenty of witnesses who can vouch for you." "And Rodney?" I asked. "I'll take care of that," Nate said, his voice calm and confident. "Just focus on your end." The weekend in Boston was surreal. Sarah was an easygoing host, showing me around the city and introducing me to her friends. We went to a Red Sox game, had dinner at a crowded seafood restaurant, and spent hours wandering through the Boston Commons. Everywhere we went, we made sure to leave a trail, receipts, photos, conversations with locals. By the end of the trip, I had a rock-solid alibi. Back in Greenville, things were happening. Rodney had been discharged from the hospital after our altercation at the party, but his bruised ego seemed to sting more than his physical injuries. He was keeping a low profile, avoiding public appearances, and probably trying to figure out how to spin the situation to save face. That's when he disappeared. I got the news from Nate on a Tuesday morning, a few days after I'd returned from Boston. He called me while I was driving the boys to school, his voice low and serious. "It's done," he said. I pulled into the school parking lot and watched Noah and Owen climb out of the car, their backpacks bouncing on their shoulders. Once they were inside, I asked, "What do you mean, done?" "Rodney's gone," Nate said. "He packed up and left town. No one's seen or heard from him since Sunday night." My heart raced. "What did you do?" "Nothing illegal," Nate said quickly. "I just convinced him it was in his best interest to leave. I didn't press him for details. Some things were better left unsaid." The fallout was immediate and dramatic. Rodney's sudden disappearance sent shockwaves through his company. Rumors swirled about why he'd left: embezzlement, an affair with an employee, a nervous breakdown. No one seemed to know the truth, but everyone had a theory. Hannah was livid. She called me the day after Rodney vanished, her voice sharp and accusatory. "Did you have something to do with this?" she demanded. "With what?" I asked, playing dumb. "Rodney's gone," she snapped. "He left without a word. And now everyone's looking at me like I'm to blame." "That's not my problem," I said coolly. "Maybe he finally realized he's a piece of garbage and decided to take out the trash." "You're unbelievable," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "You've ruined everything." "No, Hannah," I said. "You ruined everything when you decided to betray me and our family. Don't call me again." I hung up before she could respond, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. For the first time in months, I felt like I had the upper hand. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. The boys and I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, away from the house that held too many painful memories. Nate kept me updated on the situation, assuring me that everything was under control. "You're in the clear," he said during one of our calls. "No one can trace this back to you." "Good," I said. "Thanks, Nate. I owe you." "Just promise me one thing," he said. "Don't let this consume you. Rodney's gone, and you've got a fresh start. Focus on your kids, not your anger." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I will." And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. The weeks after Rodney's disappearance were a strange mixture of relief and tension. Hannah quit her job at the marketing firm, claiming she needed time to rebuild her reputation. I knew the real reason. Without Rodney to shield her, she couldn't face the whispers and judgment from her colleagues. She tried to spin it as a noble choice, telling the boys that she wanted to be home for them more. Noah and Owen, too young to understand the undercurrent of lies, seemed thrilled to have her around more often. For me, though, it was suffocating. Our relationship had deteriorated into a robotic routine. We spoke only when necessary, coordinating school schedules and doctor's appointments with the efficiency of coworkers. At meals, the silence between us was heavy, broken only by the chatter of the boys. Hannah maintained her role as the perfect mother on the surface, attending PTA meetings and hosting playdates, but there was a distance in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She was going through the motions, just like I was. 2 years passed this way. I threw myself into my work, moving up the ranks at the fuel delivery company and saving every spare dollar for the boys' future. They were my anchor, the only thing that kept me grounded as the cracks in our family widened. Hannah and I avoided talking about anything beyond logistics, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something gave way. The breaking point came when Noah, now 12, came home from school one day with tears streaming down his face. "Dad," he said, his voice trembling. "Is it true? Did she?" I froze. "What are you talking about, buddy?" He shoved his phone into my hands. On the screen was an article from a local news site detailing the scandal surrounding Rodney's departure. Someone had leaked photos and emails, painting a vivid picture of his affair with Hannah and his questionable business practices. The comments section was a cesspool of gossip and speculation, and it didn't take long for the story to make its way to the schoolyard. "It's not fair," Noah cried. "Why do we have to deal with this? It's not our fault." Owen, who was only 10, didn't fully understand what was happening but clung to me as if sensing his brother's pain. I held them both tightly, my heart breaking. "I'm so sorry," I said. "This isn't your burden to carry. I'll take care of it." The next day, I confronted Hannah. She was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone with a cup of coffee when I walked in. "Do you have any idea what's happening at school?" I demanded. She looked up, her expression blank. "What are you talking about?" "The boys," I said, my voice rising. "They're being harassed because of what you did with Rodney. That article's everywhere." Her face paled, but she quickly recovered. "That's not my fault," she said defensively. "I didn't write the article." "No, but you gave them the material," I snapped. "And now our kids are paying the price." She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "I've done everything I can to make up for my mistakes. I quit my job, didn't I? I'm here every day, taking care of them." "Taking care of them?" I interrupted. "You're barely holding it together. And now they're the ones suffering for your choices." She opened her mouth to argue, but closed it again, her eyes darting away. Without another word, she walked out of the kitchen, leaving me seething in silence. Over the next few weeks, the tension in the house reached a boiling point. The boys became more withdrawn, their laughter replaced by sullen silence. Noah started lashing out at me, angry and confused about why his world was falling apart. Owen retreated into himself, spending hours alone in his room with his Legos. Hannah and I tried to shield them from our arguments, but kids aren't stupid. They knew something was deeply wrong. Then one day, she was gone. It happened on a Saturday morning. I woke up to the sound of the boys banging on my bedroom door. "Dad!" Noah yelled. "Mom's not here." I stumbled out of bed, still groggy, and found them standing in the hallway, their faces pale with worry. "What do you mean she's not here?" "She's gone," Owen said, his voice small. "Her room's empty." I rushed to her room, and sure enough, it was stripped bare. The closet was empty, her toiletries were gone, and the only sign she'd ever been there was a crumpled note on the nightstand. I picked it up with shaking hands. "Tony, I can't do this anymore. I need to find myself and start over. Please take care of the boys." That was it. No explanation, no apology, just a few cold words and a reminder that she had always been good at running away. The weeks after her disappearance were some of the hardest of my life. The boys were devastated, especially Owen, who cried himself to sleep almost every night. I did my best to reassure them, to be both parents at once, but it was an impossible task. I had to juggle work, their school schedules, and the emotional fallout of their mother's abandonment. Hannah's parents called once, asking if I knew where she'd gone. When I told them I didn't, they sighed heavily and hung up. It was clear they weren't surprised by her actions. As for me, I was torn between anger and relief. Her leaving was a betrayal, but it also freed me from the toxic limbo we'd been living in. For the first time in years, I could breathe without the weight of her lies pressing down on me. One night, a month after she left, I sat down with the boys at the kitchen table. "We need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Noah looked up, his eyes red from crying. "What is it?" "I know things have been hard," I said, "and I can't promise that it's going to get easier overnight. But I want you to know that I'm here for you. Always." Owen sniffled. "Is Mom ever coming back?" I hesitated, then shook my head. "I don't know, buddy, but we're going to be okay. We've got each other, and that's enough." In the end, Hannah's disappearance was both a blessing and a curse. It forced me to step up in ways I never had before, to become the father my boys needed. But it also left scars, on me, on Noah and Owen, on the family we'd tried to build. I didn't know where she'd gone or if she'd ever come back. And for the first time, I realized I didn't care. My focus was on the future, on rebuilding a life for my boys and myself. Whatever happened next, I knew we'd face it together. The months after Hannah's disappearance were a whirlwind of adjustment and healing. Raising Noah and Owen on my own was no small task, but I slowly found a rhythm. I made every effort to fill the gaps their mother had left, even if that meant putting my own needs on the back burner. Then one day Nate called. "You remember my niece, Sarah?" he asked, his tone casual. "Of course," I said. "She's the one who helped me when I visited Boston, right?" "Yeah," Nate said. "She's finishing up grad school and looking for a change of pace. I mentioned your situation, and she thought she might be able to help out with the boys, maybe even stay with you for a while." At first, I hesitated. The idea of living with someone new felt like a risk, especially for the boys, who were still adjusting to the absence of their mother. But Nate assured me that Sarah was dependable and great with kids. After some thought, I agreed. Sarah moved in a week later. She was bright, warm, and endlessly patient, exactly what the boys needed. She quickly bonded with Noah and Owen, helping them with their homework, teaching them how to cook simple meals, and even organizing little game nights. Her presence brought a sense of balance to our home, something I hadn't realized we were missing. At first, our relationship was purely platonic. Sarah had her own life, and I was focused on being the best father I could be. But as time went on, something shifted. We found ourselves spending late nights talking after the boys went to bed, sharing stories, laughter, and the occasional lingering glance. It wasn't long before I realized I was falling for her. Filing for divorce from Hannah was bittersweet. On one hand, it was a step toward finally closing that painful chapter of my life. On the other hand, it was a stark reminder of everything we had lost. The process was surprisingly smooth, given her disappearance. With no objections from her side, the court granted the divorce a year later. By then, Sarah and I had become inseparable. She wasn't just my partner. She was my rock, someone I could rely on no matter what. When I proposed to her on a quiet evening at home, surrounded by the boys, she said yes without hesitation. Noah and Owen were thrilled, already referring to her as their bonus mom. Our wedding was a small, intimate affair, a stark contrast to the chaos of my previous marriage. Nate was my best man, and Sarah's best friend, Laura, served as her maid of honor. The boys played a big part in the ceremony, walking Sarah down the aisle and delivering heartfelt speeches at the reception. It was a day filled with love, laughter, and hope for the future. But as life has a way of doing, it wasn't long before the past came knocking. A year after our wedding, Sarah's cousin was getting married, and we were invited to the ceremony. It was a lavish event, held at a sprawling vineyard estate. Everything was perfect until I saw her. Hannah. She was sitting at a table near the back, her hair shorter and her face harder than I remembered. She wasn't alone, though. Sitting beside her was a man I didn't recognize, tall, muscular, and covered in tattoos. He glanced in my direction, his eyes narrowing when he noticed me. I felt a chill run down my spine. The evening took a darker turn during the reception. I was chatting with Nate near the bar when Sarah came rushing over, her face pale. "Tony," she said, grabbing my arm. "Hannah's boyfriend just tried to corner me in the hallway." "What?" I said, my heart racing. "He said they wanted to talk, but it felt more like a threat," she said. I walked away, but they're up to something. I scanned the room and spotted Hannah and her boyfriend whispering to each other near the dance floor. They glanced in our direction, their expressions tense. I turned to Nate, who nodded. "I've got your back," he said. "Let's handle this." What happened next felt like something out of a movie. Nate and I approached Hannah's boyfriend, a man she introduced as Kyle, and made it clear that we weren't going to tolerate any trouble. He laughed, brushing us off, but I noticed the way his hand clenched into a fist. Things escalated quickly. Kyle lunged at me, but Nate intercepted him, shoving him back into a table. Guests gasped as drinks spilled and chairs toppled over. Security rushed in, dragging Kyle outside while Hannah screamed at everyone to leave him alone. Sarah, meanwhile, had her own confrontation with Hannah. They disappeared into the women's restroom, and when Sarah emerged a few minutes later, she looked calm but victorious. "What happened in there?" I asked. Let's just say she knows to stay out of our lives from now on, Sarah said, a small smile playing on her lips. After that night, we didn't hear from Hannah again. It was as if she had finally accepted that her time in my life was over. The boys continued to thrive, growing closer to Sarah with each passing day. We moved into a larger house with a big backyard, complete with a tree house and a swing set. Life felt normal, better than normal, even. Looking back, I realized that everything I went through with Hannah was a painful but necessary part of my journey. It taught me the value of boundaries, the importance of trust, and the strength it takes to rebuild after betrayal. With Sarah by my side, I finally found the peace and happiness I had been searching for all along. Dear viewers, thank you so much for listening to our story all the way to the end. Your support inspires us to keep bringing you exciting tales and creating even more engaging content. Every like, comment, and subscription helps us grow and motivates us to come up with something new and thrilling just for you. Stay tuned. There are many more incredible stories ahead, and together, we'll make our YouTube channel truly unique. Thank you for being with us.